Welcome to our Grade 8 U.S. History Explainer. Okay, let's dive into this. Today, we're exploring a totally pivotal chapter in American history, the Reconstruction Amendments. That's the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. Now, these three additions were designed to fundamentally transform the nation after the Civil War. But, as you're going to see, changing the Constitution, well, that's really only the first step in changing reality. I want you to think about this for a quick second. Have you ever had a school rule, maybe something like no running in the halls or a super strict dress code, that definitely existed on paper in the student handbook, but the teachers just never actually enforced it? The rule was right there, but in practice, you could jog right past a teacher and absolutely nothing would happen. Keep that idea of text versus reality in the back of your mind, because it's the core concept of our entire explainer today. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with rebuilding the nation, then walk step by step through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Next, we'll examine text versus enforcement, and finally wrap the whole shebang up with a recap and a transfer question for you. Section 1. Rebuilding the Nation, the Era of Reconstruction. Following the end of the Civil War in 1865, this fractured nation desperately had to be stabilized. But extending citizenship and equality to formerly enslaved people required way more than just writing words on a page. It required enforcement. Enforcement is simply the act of ensuring a law or rule is actually followed in reality. Think about it. If the government writes a law but doesn't punish the people who break it, or doesn't actively protect the people the law is meant to serve, then that law completely lacks enforcement. Let's see how this actually played out. Section 2, the 13th Amendment, Abolishing Slavery, a Constitutional Solution. We begin with the very first major constitutional promise of the Reconstruction era. This was designed as a final, permanent solution to the issue of slavery in the United States. Passed by Congress in January 1865 and ratified by December of that exact same year, the 13th Amendment boldly stated, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States." With those powerful words, the United States officially abolished slavery. All right, time for a quick pause check. Think back a couple of years to 1863. President Lincoln had already issued the famous Emancipation Proclamation. So why wasn't that proclamation enough to just end slavery everywhere in the country? Take a brief moment to actively think about what President Lincoln realized here. Well, if you remembered that the Emancipation Proclamation had geographical limits, you hit the nail right on the head. It only applied to the specific areas of the Confederacy that were in active rebellion. It didn't even apply to the loyal border states that still allowed slavery but had stayed in the Union. Lincoln recognized that an executive order made during a war just wouldn't be permanent. A constitutional amendment was literally the only way to guarantee a permanent, nationwide end to slavery. Let's move to Section 3 and see how this builds. The 14th Amendment, Civil Rights, Citizenship, and Equal Protection. Okay, so with slavery abolished, the next logical question was about the status and the rights of all those formerly enslaved people. And this brings us right to the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868. This text is massive and absolutely crucial. It states, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." This was revolutionary. It formally granted citizenship to formerly enslaved people and explicitly guaranteed them due process and equal protection under the law, ensuring those rights applied to state governments, not just the federal government. Here is our second pause check. Now that these incredible promises were written into the highest law of the land, did the 14th Amendment immediately succeed in protecting the rights of Black citizens during Reconstruction? Keep our theme of text versus reality in mind. The tragic historical reality is, no, it did not immediately succeed. Actually, writing the law was completely different from enforcing it. The 14th Amendment initially failed to protect the rights of Black citizens. A really profound legacy of Reconstruction was the determined, painful struggle of citizens to make this written promise an actual reality. They had to petition, initiate court cases, and fight for decades to force the government to actually apply the equal protection it had promised way back in 1868. Section 4. The 15th Amendment, Voting Rights, the Struggle for the Ballot. That ongoing struggle for rights leads us straight into the final Reconstruction Amendment, enacted in 1870. To a lot of people at the time, this appeared to be the fulfillment of all the promises made to African Americans. The 15th Amendment explicitly targeted the ballot box, stating, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." With this, African American men were officially granted the constitutional right to vote. Now, what's really interesting about this next section is Section 5. Text versus enforcement, promise versus practice. We see a dramatic pivot here from the high ideals of the Constitution to the harsh historical reality on the ground in the American South. The gap between these two concepts is honestly staggering. The constitutional promise of the 15th Amendment was absolute. The right to vote shall not be denied based on race. Yet the enforcement reality looked entirely different. African Americans did exercise the right to vote in many southern states through the 1880s, but by the early 1890s, former Confederate states started passing local and state laws that were specifically designed to bypass the 15th Amendment and block African American voters. It's like the words on the page were completely thwarted by clever, discriminatory local rules. Southern states implemented literacy tests that were totally unfairly administered, just to stop black citizens from voting. They even created grandfather clauses, which basically said you could only vote if your ancestor had voted in the 1860s, which conveniently excluded all formerly enslaved people. On top of all this, an entire social and economic system of Jim Crow segregation was established, reducing the overwhelming majority of African Americans to second-class citizenship. History brilliantly illustrates just how long this gap between promise and enforcement can actually be. Look at this. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, but by 1896, the Supreme Court decision in Plessy v. Ferguson legalized separate but equal facilities, cementing segregation. It wasn't until almost a century later in 1965, prompted by the incredible work of the Civil Rights Movement and signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson, that Congress finally passed the Voting Rights Act. This act authorized federal supervision of voter registration to actively enforce the 15th Amendment. Literally nearly 100 years passed between the promise being written and the federal government truly stepping in to enforce it.
So, the crucial point is Section 6, Recap and Transfer Question. Looking back to look forward.
Understanding the Constitution means looking at both what the text says and how, or if, it's actually applied in the real world. Let's pull this all together. Here's our concise recap. The 13th Amendment promised the abolition of slavery, stepping in where the Emancipation Proclamation fell short. The 14th Amendment promised citizenship and equal protection, but failed initially, requiring decades of citizen struggle. And the 15th Amendment promised voting rights for black men, but was thwarted by local laws like literacy tests until the sweeping federal enforcement of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The recurring theme here is pretty clear, right? Constitutional text is incredibly powerful, but without the will to enforce it, the promise remains completely unfulfilled. Which brings us to our final thought. I want to leave you with a bit of a challenge, a way to transfer what we've learned today into the present. If you were tasked with writing a brand new law today, knowing this history, how would you ensure that its text is actually enforced in reality? What mechanisms, penalties, or protections would you build into your law so it doesn't just sit in a handbook, totally ignored? Keep that question with you as you look at the laws shaping our world today. Thank you so much for learning with me, and I'll catch you on the next explainer.